So let's look at, can somebody remind me what it said for number 1? It says solve by factoring. 5x squared. Oh, okay. 5n squared plus 2n. Okay. Do we all agree that that's what the question said? Yeah. Okay. All right. So what's your first step when you factor? Make sure you're writing notes so that you can use it as a study guide for next Friday's test. So when you factor, what do you do first? So it has to, you want to make sure you set it equal to 0. So when you're factoring, you have to start by setting it equal to 0. So what you should have done first is subtract that 7. And that's going to give you 5n squared plus 2n minus 3 equals 0. And then from there, you should make a box. And when you make your box, the A term goes top left, and the C term will go bottom right. Any questions so far? Okay. So now you need to figure out what goes in the other 2 squares. And in the other 2 squares, that would just be 2 numbers that multiply to A times C. So in this particular example, A is 5 and C is negative 3. So when you multiply those together, you should get a negative 15. And then your B term would go at the bottom. So what are my numbers that multiply to be negative 15 and add to a positive 2? Okay, 5 and a negative 3. So that would go in these 2 squares. And it doesn't matter for these 2, you could flip them. Now, the purple, that has to be there. The green, if you flip-flop them, you would still get the same answer. So from that point, you're taking out your greatest common factor. So when I look at this first column, both of these terms can be divided by 5 and n. And then a negative 3 can come out that second column. The top row, the only thing that goes into 5n squared and 3n is just the n. So just an n can come out here. And on the bottom row, the only thing is a positive 1. Now, when you use this method, there's a lot of methods to factor. But the one good thing about this method is you can check to know that you have it right, because what I have written in red on the outside, it should multiply to give me what I have inside. So I can do a quick check and be confident next week that I'm doing it correctly, because 5n times n is 5n squared. Negative 3 times n is negative 3n. 5n times a positive 1 is a 5n. And 3 times 1, negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. So students, a lot of times, they compare it to something you guys learn in biology where you have the genes and you have to do like a Punnett square or something like that. I know that's just something I hear a lot of students say. All right, so now let's go ahead and find our solution. So that 5n minus 3, set that equal to 0. And n plus 1, set that equal to 0. One of your answers should be a fraction and the other one was not. So for the first one, you would just add the 3 and divide by 5. And you should just get n equals 3 over 5. That was your first answer that I was looking for. And for my second answer, n equals negative 1. And some people put negative 1 over 1. If your denominator is 1, you don't have to put it. It's not wrong, but you don't need to put it. And that was question number 1. Okay, so completing the square, this is new material, so let's go through it again. Hopefully you have those steps copied down. If not, I did record all of the lessons last week, and you can go back and write those steps down again. But the first step, and I'll try to go through it pretty slow, this one is easier than the one that will be on the test, because the one on the test has a b value that's not 1, okay? So make sure you're looking at, I tried to make this one an easier one. But for this one, regardless, you start by moving this term over. So your first step should have been to subtract 10. Okay, when you complete the square, that's the only method that you don't want it to equal 0. Okay, so you would start by moving that C term over. And that's going to give you b squared minus 14b equals -7. So when you complete the square, you don't want all the terms on one side. You have to move that C term over. And now we need to complete the square. It's incomplete. So we need to figure out what number we are adding, because we have to add something on both sides to complete the square. And the number you add is always, whatever this number is, divided by 2 squared. So it's b over 2 squared. So in your calculator, you really shouldn't need a calculator, but if you need a calculator, that's okay. Like, we should know what 14 divided by 2 is. What's half of 14? And what's 7 times 7? So that's the number you're adding. Okay, so now we're going to factor this down, and this is a perfect square. So meaning that it's always going to factor down to something squared. So what two numbers, because we have to factor this, would multiply to be 49 and add to -14? It should be b minus 7 times b minus 7. And at this point, it's always going to factor down to b or x or whatever it is, and then whatever this number is divided by 2. Because we purposely picked a number so that it would factor down to whatever this is divided by 2. Now, whenever we have something written twice in mathematics, we don't write it twice. We say b minus 7 squared. So what we have here is b minus 7 squared, and that equals, and you add this in your calculator, if you take -7 plus 49, you should get 42. So now what are we going to do? Take the square root. So when I take the square root, that gets rid of that exponent, and I have b minus 7 equals the square root of 42. So is there a perfect square that goes in 42? 4 times, nope, 4 doesn't go in there. Does anything go in there? It has to be a perfect square. So I'm remembering that somebody did 2 times 21. But 2 times 21, 2 is not a perfect square, and 21 is not a perfect square. So that's not going to help you. 6 times 7, that also equals 42. But again, those two numbers are not perfect squares. So if you can't take a perfect square out, you leave it alone. So 42 cannot be simplified. So the only thing we're going to do, when you take the square root of a number, there's always 2 answers. So we put that plus minus in the front. And then I'm going to add the 7 to both sides. So your final answer is just 7 plus or minus the square root of 42. Just like factoring with the quadratic formula, you want to start by setting it equal to 0. So you should have 3m squared minus 10m minus 3 equals 0. So I always start off with the, this is called the discriminant. So in this quadratic, a is 3, b is -10, and c is -3. So I got a lot of different numbers for the discriminant. Minus b squared minus 4ac. So type that in your calculator just the way you see I have it written there. with the parentheses and everything. Because I think I saw like a lot of different answers for this part. I wasn't quite sure why the answers were so different for this piece. Is that 100 minus, it's 100 plus. So is it 136? Is that what you got? Raise your hand if you got 136. Okay. So we have 136, and that's under the square root. Now that can be simplified. Take 136 and divide that by 4, because I'm pretty sure 4 goes into there. Okay, so I'm going to break this apart to 4 times 34, which is 2 root 34. So this piece right here, let me write that in red. Once you have that, that's the hardest part of the quadratic formula. So now that I have that piece, all I have to do is put this in front and this on the bottom. So in front, I have the opposite of B. So B was negative 10, and the opposite would be a positive 10. Plus or minus. That's all over. And then my denominator, I would have 2 times A. A is 3. So what is 2 times 3? So this would be it. Now, if you made it to here, I did not take off a half a point. But truthfully, you should have went one more step. And that step is to divide these 3 numbers by 2. Now, you cannot touch that 34 because it's under a square root. But the other 3 numbers you can divide by 2. So the best answer to get full credit would be 5 plus or minus. The 1 is optional. You don't have to put it, but I'm going to write it all over 3. And that would be your final answer. I think that's a 3. Let me go ahead and fix that. So when we have variables, first of all, whenever there's more than one thing under a square root, you want to look at each term individually. So here, this index tells me that I need 5 in a group. So I have 10 people, and I want to put them in groups of 5. How many groups could I make? 2. Would I have anybody left out? No, because 10 is a multiple of 5. So that just simplifies to y squared. That's it. It's really simple when there's nothing left over. For question number 8, there's 3 different things underneath that cube root. And we have to look at each one separately. So I like to rewrite it so that each one has its own. And you're going to look at each one individually. So you're taking the cube root of 125, and then you're taking the cube root of x to the 6, and then you're taking the cube root of y to the 3rd. So does anyone know what number I can multiply against itself 3 times to get 125? Because that's a perfect cube. 5. So if you're not sure in your calculator, take 5 times 5 times 5, or you can type 5 to the power of 3, and you should get 125. So the cube root of 125 is 5. But now when we talk about variables, if I have 6 people, how many groups of 3 can I make? 2. So that would just be x squared. And then if I have 3 people, how many groups of 3 can I make? Just 1. So that would just be y, or you can say y to the first. Go ahead and try to do number 9 by yourself. So again, I'm looking at these individually. Does anybody want to take a guess on what you would say? Josh, did you have your hand up, Josh? A cubed. And what else? B squared. Anybody else have that? That's it. Simple. All right, so I think our next examples, we have some where we might have some left over. Yes, Amani.
Would it ever be like how, so it's 125, but it doesn't have, it's not going to any power. Will it ever be like 125 to the 6th power or anything, or if it has a number underneath the square root, it'll always just be the number?
Yeah, it'll always just be the number. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at these two. They get a little icier here. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at number 10. So for number 10, I have a square root. So I have the square root of a to the 10th. And then I have the square root of b. And I also have the square root of c to the 9th. So it's a square root. Whenever you don't see a number right here, the number is 2. So if you want to write that in, you can. So the group size is 2. So for my first one, this is pretty simple because I have an even number and 10 is a multiple of 2. So if I have 10 people, how many groups of 2 could I make? 5. And I don't have any left over. Now, but if I only have one person, I don't have enough to make a group. So what we're going to do is leave it under the square root. So let me go ahead and I just make a square root. That b has to stay. I cannot take it out because I don't have enough to take out a group. I can't make a group with only one person. With one person, I can't make a pair. So that 1b has to stay. If I have 9 people, how many groups of 2 can I make? You can make 4, but you also have somebody left out, right? All right, so I have 4, so I have c to the 4th, but I also have 1 that has to stay. And the remainder has to stay under the square root. So when you have something left over, if it's not an actual multiple of the index, then you just leave it. It has to stay. You can't do anything with it. Okay, let's look at number 11 and then we'll end there. So I have the cube root. So again, I'm going to look at -1 because negatives behave differently depending on this number. And then I have the cube root of 40. And then I have the cube root of x to the 14th. And I have the cube root of y to the 10th. Now, something that you might want to add in your notes to help you is how do we handle this negative? And it depends. So when you have a negative and this is even, then it's just going to stay. It has to stay underneath that square root or underneath the root. But if you have a negative and it's odd, then it equals -1. This is odd. Then we can actually take it out and it just becomes a -1. So that's just to kind of help you know. So because this is an odd number, it's going to equal -1. It can come out. So this changes to a -1. Now for this 40, I'm actually going to build a cake. I don't know if you all remember doing this back in Algebra 2. So if I build a cake and I start to divide this by prime numbers, so 2 goes into 40 20 times, 2 goes into 20 10 times, 2 goes into 10 5 times. I'm just building it the first time so I can model for you how you would do that. So 40 can be written as 2 times 2 times 2 times 5. So I do have a group of 3. I have a group of 3 2s, so that can come out. So right now I have a -1 that was able to break out, and I have a +2 that I could break out. Underneath the radical, so far I have a 5. So that 5 has to stay. I don't know why I put so much space. Let me go ahead and move this up right here. Okay. 14 people. How many groups of 3 can I make with 14 people? 4 groups, right? So I have x to the 4th. That can come out. But do I have any left over? I have 2, right? And where do I put those 2? Underneath the root. Good job. And I forgot I dropped that 3. There should be a 3 right here, because that's a cube root. All right, if I have 10 people, how many groups of 3 can I make with 10 people? 3. So that's y to the 3rd. Anybody left out? 1 person, and that has to stay. So the last thing I'm going to do, and I'm finished, is multiply these together. So my final answer would be -2, x to the 4th, y to the 3rd, and then you have the cube root of 5x² and y. And that would be your final answer.